I was 6 years old when my reflection began interacting with me. At first, the signs of something conscious looking back at me were implicit. I'd be playing peekaboo with myself, and the face would be slightly sillier than the wide grin expression unveiled by my curtains of fingers. Sometimes it would be more explicit. I'd watch my lips move in the mirror and hear my voice tell me a joke, but I wouldn't feel my mouth moving at all. I wasn't afraid. I still thought that Spider-Man was a viable career choice, so I'd play along with it. Although I did think it was strange that he only appeared in the bathroom across the hall from my room. Eventually, we began having real conversations about everything, from what I did in Mrs. Brown's class that day to what kind of candy or toys I liked, stuff like that. However, as I got older and began to make friends in the real world, I started to spend less time with Mirror Me. He never resented this, though he would always make it clear that as long as I was happy, we were happy. But we didn't stay happy. I was 11 years old when my brother, Corey, had been kidnapped. He was never found. He might as well have never existed, and that's how my parents dealt with it. If I ever mentioned him, I would be admonished or berated. Sometimes I'd hear my dad in the garage hitting the punching bag he got a year after Corey's disappearance, like he were beating someone to death. Other times, my mom, when she thought Dad and I were asleep, would go downstairs and smoke her open secret Pall Malls, and I'd hear her cry incessantly. And from there, the soil in my heart started hardening. I began acting out, isolating myself. It was a different time back then. Kids were kids. Kids grew out of being kids. They got over it, whatever it is, so my parents kept another problem in their throats. I was one of the few that didn't get over it. I hate it now, but my behavior became pathological. From pathology was born toxicity, and from there a certain wholeness in me was diminished. And as I began to lose that vital grasp on myself, Mirror Me became distant. Eventually, he stopped acknowledging me, despite the fact that I was continually in trouble for fighting, doing drugs or drinking, or not showing up for school. I wasn't dumb, not by a long shot. Testing out of classes I had no patience for, which was damn near all of them, wasn't as hard of a task as it seemed. Whether it was English or Calc, I aced the test. I earned a scholarship to the state university, but I had bigger plans. I was going to join the army so I could finally leave this town, my parents and Corey behind. I was driving home from a party one night, and even though I was housed, I wasn't worried. I had become a very convincing sober driver even before I was allowed to get my license, and going down one of the many back roads our barren town put my mind at ease, because there was rarely anyone on those roads, especially in the middle of the night. Well, on the night of March 4th, 2018, someone was. I wasn't driving erratically, I was careful, but when my cell phone went off, my mom was wondering where I was with her van, and I looked at it. A second, it felt like a second. I swear it was only a second, and then I wasn't alone. We met eyes, me and this random guy walking down this lonely pitch black road, and then the wheel thudded over his face. I felt a quiet detachment fall over me. I refused to look in the rear view. In the rear view, beyond the guy lying in the middle of the road, was my future. What was facing me for the rest of my life, lying somewhere in an opaque fog of uncertainty. I finally gathered the stones needed to get out of the car. I grabbed a flashlight and I ran over to the crumpled body. He wasn't moving. When I got close enough, I took off the hoodie I was wearing and used it to cover up my hand to check his pulse. Nothing. I pressed more firmly and waited. Nothing. Nothing. Then I inspected the car. No dents or anything like that. A little blood speckled around the trim of the van, but nothing that couldn't be washed off. There were damp red spots in the leftmost wheels, like they had run over a bag of meat, but that was just as easy to deal with as the trim. I looked down the road from which I came. It was either gonna be my future that was left behind, or his body. I bathed the body in light, which might have looked like the sun spoken into being by God if anyone were within a mile of it. I looked into the eyes, and I could discern no color. Crimson overtook the white of his eyes. I chose to leave the body. I got in the car, and after stopping by a self-service car wash, I drove home. I didn't leave that man on the road like I intended though. I buried him in my guts and took him home with me. And what I took with me, Mirror Me carried also. 3 days after the accident, I looked into the mirror. One morning, and my reflection had turned its back on me. I had stopped talking about my mirror self way before I hit puberty, but my parents would eventually hear me screaming at my reflection. Psychiatry, therapy, none of that helped. Like I said, I wasn't stupid, and I wasn't deluded either. His turned back perturbed me so badly I started to slip. Once I noticed that he had taken a few steps towards my bed a year after the accident, I shattered it and cut my wrists open lengthwise. I spent the next 2 days in the ER with doctors trying to save my life and another 4 months in the psychiatric wards, talking about my supposed hallucinations. I knew it was all real, but what was real wasn't going to help me. I lied about realizing that this other me in the mirror was all fiction, an imaginary friend that obviously overstayed its welcome because I lost my brother. And even though it was a lie, the therapy did help me. I finally had a place to talk about the baggage I was carrying. I cried more times in there with strangers than I had ever around my friends or family. I felt like I was coming back. The only thing that would remain dead was the stranger in my guts. I came to terms with his death and left it at that. When I left the hospital, I moved on with my life. I decided not to join the army, not that I could with my recently updated mental health records, and went to state to study English. I distanced myself from my parents for a few years and got to know myself and allow myself to be known. Over time, I stopped doing every drug except weed, and I still like to drink whiskey and beer, but cut down immensely. I had become not only mentally, emotionally, and physically better over time, but I learned how to leave the dead man and Mirror Me where they belonged. In the past. Before my graduation, I got a call from my dad and we talked. Apparently, they had been going to couples and individual therapy not long after I left the house. They said nearly losing me was the most terrifying thing that ever happened to them. I was their only son now. When I met up with them, we all finally let it out as a family, for Corey, for what had become of us. Eventually, I returned to our house. Over the years, I was convinced that since he was walking away from me, that he was probably gone. But I avoided the bathroom in particular for days nonetheless. They thought it was strange, but understood why I was using their bathroom. But but that couldn't last. On the second night, my dad and I had been drinking quite a bit, reminiscing about Corey. I didn't remember much, so my dad did most of the talking. I think my mom was still too sensitive to openly talk about him without provocation, but she added to the stories here and there. In the morning, the revolt in my stomach couldn't be stopped. I tried to get to their bathroom without vomiting on the floor. The halls, feeling like a rolling tunnel, made it hard enough to get to their room in the first place, but it was locked. They were still asleep. I knocked desperately, but they wouldn't wake up. So I had no choice, so I ran to the bathroom and discharged what must have been at least 15 beers. I laid my head on the lip of the toilet, waiting until the room stopped spinning. When the dizziness subsided enough for me to get on my feet, I stood up and saw something in the mirror. While the room that used to be mine had been changed into an office for my mom, in the mirror it looked exactly like it did 4 years ago. There was also a familiar back turned to me. It was Mirror Me. Now he was standing next to my old bed. I was frightened by what this could mean. My head spun around immediately and I began to panic, but I caught myself before I could be thrown down to the winds of anxiety. At first, I stuttered but managed to speak. Immediately, he was dragged underneath the bed. There wasn't a struggle. He didn't fight what had grabbed him. He was just gone. I almost screamed and turned back to see the closed door from my mom's office. I looked back in the mirror. Now, something was crawling out from underneath the bed. I couldn't believe my eyes. They watered and I began to drool. My fear had slowed my motor skills, and all I could do was stay in place and watch the man I killed with my mother's van crawl out from under my bed. He didn't have blue eyes. His dead eyes glowed crimson with the intensity of a flashlight in the middle of a black forest blasting into them. At first, we just stared at each other, and then he took one step forward.